Hey everybody, this is Tommy and I'm Kimberly and we're from Ravens Creek. Today we wanted to talk to you a little bit about what it means to be an heir, to be a child, and to be a son of God.
In our modern Christianity, there's a lot of misconceptions about biblical manhood, but a lot of this also stems from what we call being a child of God, and even further, being a son. We have misconceptions about what it means to be mature, and we think of like the mature are the ones who give the meat, and we think of being mature as being something like you are somehow more intellectual or you have deeper understanding of the Bible, and we don't even realize it all stems from what you are and not specifically what you do.
A famous passage that Paul throws out there is, "When I was a child, I thought like a child, I acted like a child. But when I grew up, I put those childish ways behind me." Paul's talking about developing character, developing mindsets. And when we're talking about being children of God or sons of God, we're talking about learning the wisdom of God.
And this is where it comes into various steps. When we read like 1 John chapter 2, it starts with this idea of, I talk to you children, I talk to you young men, I talk to you fathers. And he goes through this series of why he's talking to each one. And when we're children, we've just been introduced to the faith. There's a lot of things that we come in with baggage, if I can use such a phrase, but we don't comprehend maybe the depths and the wisdom of God is really what it comes down to. We don't always see his mindset.
We're learning a lot of the things that God approves of, a lot of things that pleases his heart. Just like children, we're learning to take this walk and step by step until our feet get steady. And then once our feet get steady, it's about keeping out of trouble.
And one of the texts that really speaks to us about this subject would be in Galatians at the very end of chapter 3, that first part of chapter 4. And in this, Paul is explaining how children are underneath the law as a child would be underneath the servants. And we have been put underneath the law in a way that we can grow up and learn what are the things God approves of. How are we supposed to interact in the house of God?
Paul goes so far to say, depending on the version of the Bible, that not only is the child, the small child, under a servant who's there to help raise the child, but they're even under the slave. Even a slave is over a young child because he doesn't understand what the whole community of the family is doing yet.
And this is part of certain versions of the Bible in Luke 2. When Jesus is at the temple and his parents come and try to find him, they say, "Why have you done this to us?" And Jesus responds with, "Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?"
Now we find Jesus at the temple talking to the teachers, and he's at the age that it would be normal for a Jewish and Hebrew child to be at the temple debating on scriptures. He's at the age that we refer to in modern Judaism as being bar mitzvahed.
Generally around the age of 13 in modern Judaism, that's when you get your bar mitzvah. It's when you're officially a man. So you're no longer a child. Now you are stepping into the inheritance to become the heir, to become the one who's reflecting your father's business.
The interesting thing is the phrase bar mitzvah means child of the covenant. So we're finding God directly relating and putting his name under the covenant. And being a child, in this case, isn't about being a small, unknowing person, but about following in the footsteps of the Father.
Part of growing up, not physically as well as spiritually, part of growing up is that you do start to learn a maturity. It's kind of an interesting duality here that even you can think of in your own life. You don't expect a 5-year-old to be held to the same responsibility that you'd put on a 15-year-old. And likewise with a 25-year-old, 45-year-old, etc., you expect at certain milestones in life, there's a certain maturity that they've come unto. in spiritual terms, it's not necessarily a numerical number of years, but there is a certain maturity in which you start to embrace the things that God shows himself to be, and you start to reflect this, and you start to understand what it is that God is in the business of, and you start to be able to inherit that and walk in those footsteps.
So when we come into Luke chapter 2, it's usually something we quickly pass over, perhaps in the Christmas story, perhaps just after Christmas. But as many people as make the assumption that Jesus went with his parents to then become perhaps a carpenter by trade, very few people take the time to realize what this tiny piece of scripture is saying. Jesus says, I need to be in my Father's house.
Right.
Some versions say, I need to be about my Father's business. When you're Hebraic, when you're Jewish, this is the same thing. You're learning the trait, you're learning the craft, you're learning how to inherit the family business.
Oftentimes this would be associated with being a rabbi, to be about your Father's business, meaning God as Father. This would be, you're entering into the school of Christ, as we would put it in Christianity, but obviously with Jesus it's not necessarily that phrase. But the idea is this son of the commandment. What is it that the heart of the commandments really are expressing? More than just the letter of the law, what is the spirit of the law? What is it that God is conveying? How is he portraying himself through this to Israel and to the nations? Because even Israel, in obeying the commandments, are told in Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 6 that this is going to be a display to the nations.
So we find in the Bible that when God gives us commandments, it's not just this rule-keeping list, but it's like he's explaining the business to us. This is how we operate as a family. This is how my business operates. And you as children should learn how to follow these traits so that you can become heirs and one day inherit this business and become a representative.
This even gets in the New Testament. We find certain passages that talk about how we are co-heirs with Christ, or even co-rulers, I think is in one place, I don't remember. But this idea of being given the inheritance and being co-heirs. Why are we co-heirs with Jesus? Why is it that he's not the one who's inheriting alone, but all of us are inheriting? There's something here that's happening, that a corpus is being made of the children of God with Christ.
We're finding that God gives us the commandments and covenant to show us the full operation. But it's not something that we can understand so much as young children, but as we grow up into sonship, into heirs, then things start to become clearer, because no longer are we using our childish mindset to view these things as a duty and a task and a chore for every day. But now, this is something we can do to grow.
And we can begin to learn that the commandments and the covenant are deeply interrelated, where you cannot have the one without the other. When we're talking about the commandments or law, oftentimes in Christianity we think of like this negative thing that Paul was saying, we're not underneath anymore. But what we neglect to understand is that the law is this idea of rules and regulations, of this do this, don't do that kind of mentality. But we eventually come to a maturity where we realize it's not about do this, don't do that. Oh, you haven't read your Bible enough today, or oh, you haven't prayed enough, or are you keeping the kosher diet, or are you not keeping the kosher diet? It's instead learning the heart of it and to reveal that in your everyday life.
And in revealing that, there's a maturity that's taking place. It's bringing you up into the next level of maturity that God can work with.
And here it's no longer about trying to impress your father because he's your hero, but it's about reflecting the Father and going out and, as Jesus would put it, If you see me, you see the Father. I and the Father are one. Or the statement of, I don't speak anything except for what the Father gives me. I don't do anything except for what I see the Father doing. These are things that we can actually experience and also reflect in our own lives.
And this is to find a freedom, not more constraint, not more, how do I make him happy?
Mm-hmm.
This is to show that I'm serious, I love God, and I want to continue in his business, to be about his business.
We heard an old saint once talk about, in his own life, he used to have to pray about everything. What should I eat this morning? What should I wear this morning? What should I be doing with these hours of the day? But as he grew up, he realized what he's doing is what God desires him to do, because he's now apprehended something else than just this follow him around and try to figure out where he's leading me. There's something else here where he's actually giving me an understanding and a wisdom to be able to then make my own decisions, and in those decisions I'm still reflecting him, I'm still doing his will.
As children, we like to play games and such to help us to learn patterns, to learn tricks, to learn puzzle solving, and ways to comprehend outside of our childishness. And as we grow up, we start seeing like, oh, we didn't just play that game and learn this, but we learned how to get along with others, and we learned how to add, and we learned how to run around and keep healthy.
And these things become second nature to us even.
But there comes a point when you're grown up and you're not playing these games so much, but you're taking the lessons that you've learned from them, and you're moving forward.
In representing God and taking over his business, so to speak, the thing to note is that as sons and daughters, as being part of these who inherit, there is something that we're actually inheriting. It's not like this ethereal theological idea that's out in voodoo land somewhere. We are actually, there's a tangible thing that we are a part of.
Jesus makes the very simple but profound statement that if you were children of Abraham, then you would act like it. So when we look into something like sonship from the Bible and in God's view, what we see is if we want to act like sons and daughters and children of God, then we need to act like it. We need to reflect God and his character.
And I find it interesting that when you go to Galatians chapter 3 and 4 that we've been referencing, and you continue to read past just this discussion of how the slaves are raising the children, but eventually the children grow up and no longer are the slaves and the servants the ones who are over them. You continue onwards and you eventually find this discussion of Sinai and Zion as reflected in Haggai and Sarah. And it's almost like what Paul is showing us is the reality unto which we are inheriting, the reality unto which we're growing is what's called Zion, the New Jerusalem, which is above and it's free.
One of the things we find when we hear this phrase that Zion is above, she's our mother, she's free, you have this fuller picture happening, and you start getting it from both ends to find out who you are and where you are in the middle. You have, if you're children of the Father, then you act like the Father. And if Zion is our mother and she is free, then we're also going to take in her characteristics and her traits. And bringing the two together, we start to find out who we are, where we are, what are we doing, what is this family business that we are a part of.
And part of growing up into maturity and into sonship, part of growing up and becoming more than just a child, but now a son or a daughter, what you are becoming, or part of what you're understanding now, is knowing from whence you've come. You're no longer looking at yourself as coming from your biological parents, although it's obviously true, but now there's an eternal perspective that stems back to Adam being a son of God, stems forward to the eternal city coming down out of heaven, and the saints are going to dwell there with God.
At the same time, at the same time, we're not taking on our old identity. We're not identifying ourselves as we once did. Now that we realize who our mother and our father truly are, we continue to grow up and to learn those characteristics without having to memorize them and beat ourselves over the head to get these things memorized and to get the godly grade.
Something that I've found to be quite amazing is when the prophets talk about how they've seen God. Oftentimes you can slew all of the visions together and they all seem to be reflecting a similar scene. Even in Revelation chapters 4 and 5, it seems to be a similar scene as what Ezekiel saw in chapters 1 through 3 and what Isaiah saw in chapter 6 and Micaiah in 1 Kings 22 and etc. And even Moses on the Mount. But the whole point, this is bringing us into the fuller picture of there's an actual reality by which we are living. We can perceive what it is to be a part of. We can perceive what it is that we're actually inheriting. We can perceive where it is that we're coming from. And because we can see it, because we can experience it, we can then reflect it.
One of the things we find that when God calls us into maturity, one of the great things the Bible records is that he calls us to be overcomers. Another great thing that Jesus calls us to be is the servant of all.
Yeah.
Now, if we were under a wisdom that wasn't coming from our mother and our father, those would seem to be in conflict with one another. However, when God is our father and Zion is our mother, and they're calling us to reflect their character and their freedom, we see how those are the powerful combination that brings all things into restoration.
And when you read in Revelation 2 and 3, when Jesus is talking to the churches and he says, this is what I see and this is what I have against you. And he says, if you overcome, then this will be the reward. You look at what it is that Jesus is saying to overcome. They're oftentimes the most simple statements. That Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, disband from her and come out from the teaching that she's giving you because she's perverting you into sexual immorality.
When Jesus also speaks to another church and says, I know the works you have, and you claim to be alive, but you're dead. You claim to be rich, but you're poor. Part of what we see happening there is we're still acting like children, and we're not coming into the sonship, into the daughtership, and in becoming heirs of Christ. We're still acting like children when we should have long ago put those childish ways behind us.
And this is even true with the first church mentioned, with Ephesus. You've left your first love. There came a point in which now they're meticulously trying to examine whether somebody's an apostle or not an apostle. They're trying to meticulously understand what it is that the Bible is teaching, and it's become a cold, dead religion of do this, don't do that. And the whole point of the do this, don't do that was to bring you to a place of maturity, to bring you to a place of freedom where you'd realize, I have an inheritance, I have something that I'm supposed to be.
But sometimes what happens with our do this and don't do that, we come to this point where we say, God, we've been serving you this whole time. We've been working so hard this whole time. We did everything you told us. And yet you treat everyone all the same. They're not working hard and you're giving them the same thing. These are some common childish practices that do infiltrate in our thinking.
Part of what we're taught in our modern day Christianity is this idea of doing, that there's always this, are you serving somewhere? Are you teaching this? Are you doing, what are you doing? Etc., etc. It goes on from there. But the whole point that God is always trying to bring is come up the mount and be there. Reflect who I am. Be this. And part of the business that God is about is the restoration of all things, which does not come about by doing, but by being.
We notice as individuals, if we've never spent time with our fathers as children, it almost doesn't matter how good of a parent they were, because they taught us many things, they provided many things, and yet they were never there. If we never spend any time just being with the Father, then we're not going to understand when it comes time to grow into that maturity what he's really about, what his business is about. And we're going to find that we have that resentment towards God. Like, I did what you asked, because we don't understand why he asked it, because we didn't take the time to just be there.
And in being and it reminds me of a quote of St. Francis Assisi, who tells his followers at all times to preach the gospel and, if necessary, use words. As if you can preach without using words. And yet that's exactly it.
This is part of the maturity that God intends to bring us into, is that we understand that the man is the message.
Yeah.
That when you missed your Bible reading for the day, that God doesn't condemn you. He doesn't look down and he doesn't say, you didn't spend time with me today. All he's doing is saying, can I speak to you for a moment? Do you have a moment now? Or he might not even ask that. He might say, I notice how busy you are and that you need rest. Don't push yourself. Get some sleep. We'll talk tomorrow in the morning.
And this is completely contrary to the wisdom of the principalities and powers, who have to build for themselves majestic temples to dwell in. And everything's about more, everything's about bigger, everything's about serving more intensely. And yet God's like, I'm actually worried about you. So if there comes a point where he just simply says, you need to rest, that's it.
Do that. Nothing that you could speak in a prayer and nothing that you can read in the Bible will make sense at that point when the Lord's asking you to rest. You have to have the faith of a mature son, daughter, child to believe that if the Father asks you to take a vacation day, that he can handle it, that you're not going to fall behind, and you're not going to find you don't have enough spiritual provisions because you took a vacation. If anybody tells you that God would allow that, that is the wisdom of the principalities. That's demonic voices trying to speak to you. That is not God's voice saying, you didn't do enough today. I'm taking it out of your pay. God never does that. That's not the Father he is. That's not the business he runs, and that's not the family that he's growing.
And part of us taking on his business of the restoration of all things, ironically, what we find the New Testament speaking about is living a peaceful and quiet life in all godliness and holiness. Whereas we would think like we're supposed to be missionaries and going out and evangelizing or something, the whole New Testament is speaking to us about living in peace and quiet. And this stems directly from Deuteronomy and other books of the Old Testament that talk about when you come into the land, you will have peace on all sides. And you're going to be there as a witness for me in your peace. It's not about them doing anything. Just them being there is enough.
God is capable of moving his people at the correct time.
To the correct
place. Exactly. And he's capable of letting you go when you're not listening and you think you need to do. And he'll let you get all worked out. You feel you're burnt out. You feel you're abandoned. And he's still asking you if you want to rest. And you think you're impressing God by doing more. Who has ever impressed God? There are those in the Bible, the saints, that God says, this is my friend. This is a man after my own heart. If we're trying to hit that level, we're going to have to take quiet time, take a restful time, and learn what that heart and what that character is. As long as we're keeping score of how much God owes us, we are not growing up into maturity. We are not going to be able to become heirs and to represent God.
Oftentimes, when we think of the people throughout history who have influenced whether Christianity or the Bible the most, God's people, the first names that come to mind are usually the reformers, people like Calvin or Luther. We think of even Jerome or Augustine, some of the big names in the early church. But what we don't realize is that when we try to have this one-upmanship game of who's the better saint, who did more, who spoke more, who was more correct with their theology, etc., we are not using God's wisdom. We are not bringing the restoration of all things. We are not bringing Zion to earth. We are not being representatives of God.
We're not even growing up to the point where we can be representatives of God.
Right.
And we need you to understand that this growing up, it's not a task, it's not a chore, it's freedom. It's the chance for your spirit to express what it was made for and to help others to get to that place as well.
So often in our society, it's not even just our Christianity, but in our society, we're looking for formulas. We're looking for the how do I get to that result? And so if I go from here to here to here to here, I get to that result, but there is no formula. There is no journey, so to speak, in that way. It's very much a personal, you spend time with God, you spend time understanding and learning as to who He is, and that's what changes the world.
We need to not be afraid to take this risk of being holistic, of not using the formulas, but spending time with God, but being willing to rest when we need to rest, of not beating ourselves over the head because we did something wrong, but to know that's wrong. It's embarrassing to the family. It doesn't represent God's business, and we need to correct it.
In our churches today, we have endorsed the formulas in a way that has really resulted in a lot of negative things. When the worship isn't bringing it on home and causing for people to lift their hands and have that holy posture, we turn up the amplifiers. We employ certain catchwords and catchphrases because we know these are what's going to get the right result in our sermon, getting the amens or the altar calls. Or if nobody's coming up to the altar call, we're not getting enough people, we'll just continue pushing that altar call for the next 25 minutes saying, this is the last time I'm going to say anything. But we all know it's not. That is not employing the wisdom of God. That is teaching slavery to your people. That is causing them to continue in their debauchery and to continue in serving an idol that they call God, and they don't even realize the heart of the Father because we are so thinking that we're bringing Jesus and we're bringing our own kingdoms.
And this is what Paul is talking about in Galatians 3 and 4. That as long as we act like this, the servant is over us, the slave is over us, because that's not the Father's business. That's not growing up and becoming an heir. That's not bringing maturity. This is childish games that we play.
I find it ironic that the people who are the heaviest against the Hebrew roots movement are they themselves who are the Judaizers, who continue to bring the law down saying, do this, don't do that. Continuing to push these formulas and 3 Ps and 10 ways to reset your prayer life and how to know God better and how to study your Bible and all of the stupid nonsense. It's just corruption.
This is not what God puts on us. These are things that we do and we choose to do because we think the Father's business is too hard. But we haven't even taken the time to figure out what His business is.
We have the keys and refuse to go in ourselves.
Because we're spending so much time with our to-do lists, and we're not spending time with the Father. We're not spending time taking the rest.
We're not taking the effort to learn the character that we're supposed to have the spirit of grace and supplication, the beauty of holiness, reflecting the image of Christ and the image of God through each other's faces.
And that's maturity. And if someone told you that growing up is hard, so you're afraid to grow up into the Father's business and afraid to be spiritually mature because you may have to learn theological words and isms, That's not what it's about. God is in the restoration of all things business.
And if you've been told that the Father's heart is deep and it's scary, you have no idea. It's full of love. And it's in such a way that we think, for some reason it scares us. It can only be the lie of the principalities, the lie of the devil to tell us so. Let us not forget it was the Father who sent Jesus.
If you find yourself struggling and searching, we ask you to come check us out. And we together can go through this messy, unclean situations to bring you some Raven's food and provision for today.